Today, Sergey is going to share a little bit about his knowledge and expertise on building MVPs, and I'm actually interested because I've never seen any of your presentations, but we got introduced through a good friend of mine who has been working on a project with him, and so I'm stoked to hear what you have to share. And there are people kind of trickle in. Try and speak loud because we don't have a microphone for the people in the back, and this should pick you up. And
Sounds great.
Take it away.
Jeff, thank you so much for the introduction. So, guys, very excited to be here, and this is a wonderful space, and this is a really great place where the company is being built. Now, if you look, every company at some point will have to go through defining the product and building an MVP, going through the prototype and building an MVP. So some of these slides, majority of them, come from my experience building MVPs for my own companies, and also I consult with a ton of startups. This is not a shameless plug. It's more like I often get invited to look at the MVP that the companies have built, or they're 90% done. It's called basically a 90% problem. And I'll show you what that means in their minds when they say we built an MVP 90% way there, right? So what does that really mean? So there's going to be a couple of stories in terms of what I've seen and sort of try to connect it both academically, what I've seen in academia, and also what I've seen in sort of real companies running out there. So before we get started with any of this, I often do this in my presentations. Everybody sort of comes in with some notion what they're going to see, but there's some kind of burning question usually in your mind. So I'll try to put down at least 5 questions that you guys want answered out of this talk. So who has a particular question that they want answered, and hopefully it gets covered in the presentation, and if it's not, I could potentially focus on it. So any particular things you would want to know as a carry away from this presentation? Yes?
Building hypothesis for MVPs, what's the process?
Okay.
Instead of like shooting in the dark.
Building. So you're basically trying to do, sorry about that. So what you're trying to do is try to prove out a particular hypothesis by building an MVP, correct? So yes.
So you're not wasting time just testing every hypothesis.
I guess it goes to the core of what is the MVP for, right? So building hypothesis. Okay. Anybody else?
Listening to users versus taking the responsibility yourself and developing.
Okay. So user feedback, right? So I hear this a lot. We practice here user-driven product development, right? So, but you also read a couple of quotes like from Ford, who said, if I listened to my customers, I would have built them a faster horse, right? So it's was it Steve Jobs?
No.
Okay.
Steve Jobs is like, I tell them what they want.
Yeah, well, sure. So I think it varies between, if you're thinking of evolutionary product, listening to your customers sometimes could be a bad thing, but at the same time, we're also going to talk about the concept of adjacent possible, and you will see what that actually means from a product development point of view. This is a concept that comes from biology. So anybody else?
How robust does your MVP need to be?
Okay. Robust MVP. So if you're not embarrassed by it, it's not an MVP. So that's that sort of thing. So you should be embarrassed by it. But robustness, we're going to cover some of that. And it goes to the heart of, who's the MVP for? Yes.
Yeah, if you're not doing something purely digital, how big does your MVP need to be?
How big does your MVP have to be? So size of the MVP. And the last one. Yes?
Is there any reason not to do, let's say, 5 mini variations on their MVP?
Okay. So you're talking about the MVP testing, sort of, or producing multiple?
Before you bear test it with users, right? Is there
Um,
any reason not to do this one MVP with 5 mini variations?
5 mini MVP variations, not 5 mini prototypes, but really 5 mini MVP variations, right? Okay. So MVP variations. Okay. Great. All right. So I think majority of these topics are actually going to be covered one way or the other. So that's good. So again, a little bit of my own background. I'm the CIO and the Chief Product Officer for a company called Pushpoint in San Francisco. So I think the later part of my career is sort of reflective of what I've been doing for the past 5 years. So I've been a Chief Product Officer and Chief Technology Officer. So I have a firm foot in the technology background as well as the product. So later on in my career, I basically realized that there was always a conundrum in my head. So there's companies with great technology that end up failing, right? So there's lots of companies with the product and poor technology end up succeeding. What is the result, right? So I think in my mind, the combination of understanding of the product and being product-centric, as well as the ability to put it together really, really matters. I also have lots of startups and few established companies. So I also have a big company background and sort of startup companies and early stage, mid stage, late stage startups, and that's where I prefer to be. Large companies is sort of not my forte. I tried that, didn't quite like it for a number of different reasons, but I think you just don't get to tinker a lot, right? So the startups is places for you to tinker and learn. So that's why I like startups a lot. And again, I have a pretty sort of also deep educational background. So I started in tech, and I have a BA in computer science and master's in computer science and PhD in business. And again, my PhD was centric to experimentation. So multivariate testing, I came up with my own algorithm how to test, and I really like that experience as well. Again, some of the expertise, real-time bidding, A/B testing, and some of the techs that I've been involved. All right, so some of the agenda that we're going to cover. We're going to cover MVP considerations and debt avoidance, technical debt, organizational debt, process debt, and infrastructure debt. If I could summarize what this talk is going to be really about, it's going to be some of the considerations around the MVP. We're not going to talk about wireframes, clickable prototypes. We're not quite going to do that. The assumption here is that you've done the homework. From a startup perspective, you built the deck, and from there, you build a prototype, and you're really ready to build an MVP, right? So some of the lessons are going to be in debt avoidance. Don't do it in a way that's going to accumulate a lot of debt, disproportional debt. And we're going to look at various debt items. A lot of times you hear about, how many people here have heard about technical debt?
Actually, never heard that term.
Never heard of technical debt?
No, I was wondering how you're using the word debt in your presentation.
Sure. So from a technical debt perspective is basically, well, you'll see the definition for the debt. And again, all across the board, technical debt and debt avoidance, organizational debt, process debt, all of these things, sort of doing things in a less than optimal way and sort of postponing it for later, is going to result in debt, right? So that debt later on will have to be repaid. All right, so let's cover the MVP. So Mini-Me, in my view, is an ideal MVP. So why is Mini-Me an ideal MVP? Because he has a core functionality of the product that later on is going to be built. Just sort of let's look at it. So he has an identical DNA, right? So it's probably the same technology. It's going to get used later on in the product, and it's going to be evolutionary. Same major features, same major functionality, same usability. Not up to scale and not as pretty, right? So I think, in my mind, that's an ideal MVP. So minimal viable product. So what does viable stand for, right? So viability for whom, right? What are we trying to do with MVP? So Eric Rice defines the MVP as version of the product that allows the team to collect maximum amount of information from the users, right? So if it's at the point where the information that you're collecting from the users, it's all broken, then I think it's ready to put out there to start collecting information. And it's sort of the intersection of the product that nobody wants to use, so it's a very fine line between, well, it's really, really crappy product or crappy prototype that I don't want to use. So from a company that would have built a full product, so it's this intersection here in an MVP that amounts to an MVP. So some of the difficult things from an MVP perspective. So prototype versus an MVP. How do I distinguish a prototype versus an MVP? MVP versus a product. At what point do I stop, right? So at what point? Sorry, I thought it was my phone. I actually have the same ringer. So a lot of times when I come into the companies, they say we have an MVP, but they really don't. They have a prototype, right? And there's a fine distinction. And also, at what point do you stop sort of tinkering with an MVP, and otherwise you're going to go and build out a full product that potentially later on needs to be changed. So I think intent really matters, right? So you need to have in your mind, what is it that I'm exactly building? Don't try to build a mermaid, right? So you always get a wrong half. So if you try to build sort of a semi-prototype, semi-MVP, semi-product, you get a wrong half. When you want a woman, you get a fish. When you want a fish, you get a woman. So don't try to do that. So have a particular intent in mind when building an MVP. And again, continuously keep in mind who is this you're building it for. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, I'm completely interrupt driven. So if you guys have a particular question, want me to stop, want me to come back, so this is perfectly fine. Any questions so far?
Yes. You're going to go into depth on these?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, some of these are going to be definitely covered in depth. So defining an MVP. So I think from a product, so minimal viable product to a product, it's pretty clear, right? So it's easy on donuts, not so very easy with software. But from a product perspective, I think from a minimal viable perspective, it's the same base, right? So I can have a different type of donut, I can fill it in with jelly, or I can have whatever I want to have, and I can have sprinkles on top. But it's really the core, it's the base, right? So typically, people don't have a hard time distinguishing between minimal viable product and an actual product. But difficulties come in when you talk about the prototype. So, right, so everybody can easily recognize, on the right-hand side, you have a prototype. On the left-hand side, you have an MVP. So this is really an MVP or a product of MVP or the prototype of an iPad, right?
Wait, the product is on the right or the prototype is on the right?
MVP is on the left, sorry. The prototype is on the right.
Isn't that a finished iPad or no?
Oh, that one is not finished.
The one on the right.
The one on the right is a prototype. That's how they drew it.
Oh, okay.
How they drew it, and no, that's not from a product. It's from a prototype perspective. So MVP versus the prototype. So how do you sort of put it in your mind? MVP is the test product viability. It tests assumption, it tests the market, it tests product usability, and gets the user feedback. From a prototype perspective, it just demonstrates the concept, right? So you're really trying to demonstrate the concept. Quite often, you use a prototype for the purposes of getting money from the investors, right? So you want something to put something in front of them besides just a product stack in order for you to get funding. Conceived by, it just basically convinces others that you're serious, right? So the prototype is, I just didn't have an idea, and at some point decided, you know what, I'm gonna go and just ask others for the money and just put the deck, and that's it. It gives others the conviction that you're serious about building it, and it gets you sort of this seed money.
But does the prototype go beyond, in your mind, wireframes, or does it actually work, or is it
prototype
just like,
actually works?
It would actually.
So
okay.
prototype would actually work. So if you were putting together a prototype, you definitely would probably start with some sort of wireframes and whatnot, put together high fidelity mock-up. And again, it's just depending on what it is. From iPad perspective, it was difficult to come up with something that would really work, but demonstrating the concept for sure. So if you have, yes.
Sorry, I wanted to let you talk first, and then I wanted to interrupt. Well, so
Go ahead.
now I interrupted anyway. I was wondering when you create that product, for example, you have an app, and you need to show it to your users, right? Like, do you have a certain group of people that you show the naked version of what you're working on, and obviously they know it's
So
MVP and it should not work, but it's still.
Are you talking about the alpha testing, beta testing process? So alpha testing either from a prototype perspective or as well as the minimal viable product perspective, you definitely should have a group of users, and again, we'll cover this a little later. you will see in terms of what is that process now looks like. So with crowdsourcing these days, you can actually go and pay people to get the users that are going to test the product, and their expectation is that things might break, right? So that they're not going to be grading you whether some things break or not. So it's the intent in your mind, right? So which is later on sort of changes when you're having actual users in front of it, but their expectation is it's either private data or closed data. But you definitely want, from a usability perspective, seeing how people interact with the software, you want to put in front of them as early as possible.
So yeah, that needs to work.
Yes, it definitely needs to work. All right, so again, another distinction between the MVP and the prototype is who builds it, right? So typically, I've seen that the prototypes are built by a single guy, right? So, there's a couple of founders, right? So if those founders are non-technical, there's usually some guy that they're going to go and pull them a CTO or basically get what we call a lead developer, right? So you get a lead developer, you develop a prototype, and that's it, right? So from an MVP perspective, MVPs are usually built by the teams, and MVPs require MVTs, which is minimal viable teams, and we'll take a look at what MVTs in my mind look like. So built, again, they're evolutionary in nature, right? So MVP is evolutionary in nature. You usually build an MVP and you start iterating on top of it. So you will definitely later on turn it into the product. So usually it's not designed, unless there are some exceptions, usually not being designed in order to be thrown away. So hopefully you had a lot of the structural learnings with your prototype, and you converting basically through a prototype away and building an MVP that you're going to be building on top of. All right, so how many people have seen Rogers' adoption curve? Okay, so it's a curve of adoption of the product, right? So you see that you have innovators, early adopters, early majority, and so on. So who is MVP built for? So if I'm designing an MVP, who am I designing it for? So yes, so you cheated, you've seen my other talk. So yes, so early adopters are the ones that are going to be using your prototype, right? So again, the early adopters are going to either recognize it as brilliant, they're going to give you a feedback, but just working out the kinks, so you pass the stage of the prototype, it's pathetic, and innovators looked at it, and that's pretty much it. So if you look at the actual percentages, there is about 13% of all attended people that are going to be using your product in that category. So if you sort of think about it, all possible people that can use your product, then MVP is getting tested by early adopters, which is about 13% of your overall intended users. Any questions there?
What is the vertical between early adopters and early majority?
It's a chasm.
The chasm?
Yes. So it's a chasm, and the chasm occurs because there's quite a bit of rework that you actually have to do, right? So before you can get into the early majority, before that adoption really occurs, there's a strong chasm, right? So it's definitely a gap that just give you all of the time to rework your MVP and add additional things in order to make it. So again, the nature of the MVP, right? So getting the feedback from the users and adopting based on it.
Is that typically more feature enhancements or like robustness and like platform enhancements going to the cabinet? In your experience, like going
in my
across
experience,
that?
it's usually usability. So it's exactly the same features besides maybe one or two.
Really?
But it's usually usability. So what you get is you get a lot of feedback. I wasn't sure what to do, right? So I was confused exactly how to use it, and so the usability of it gets changed. So usually new features don't get thrown in, some get thrown out. So I haven't seen a lot of work really clamoring for this feature, even though it can happen. Majority of the feedback that I've seen occurring in this chasm is basically a usability.
Because of those early adopters are more forgiving.
They're definitely more forgiving, but they're sort of looking at the the product and not necessarily being robust or anything like that. They're just looking at greater usability of the product itself. So MVP targeting targets, who are the early adopters, right? So you have educators, influencers, opinion makers, social connectors. So these are the people who are going to give you very valuable feedback, and they're ones that are going to help you breach the chasm, right, and get it into the early majority. And so you should definitely be sort of targeting these people as a specific category. So MVP features, right? So that's another thing, right? So less is truly more. I've seen a lot where just MVPs are packed with so many features, and they're really not a core functionality of the product. They just basically add more things and add more things, but not necessarily just confusing users more, right? So the first thing the users are confused to begin with, right? Because they really haven't seen your product. It's hard to understand. It's a new concept. So they need to get used to it. The more it's packed with features, then you really truly need to think about. The way I kind of think about it, if this feature is taken away, is it going to be possible to sell this product or not, right? So if it's sort of almost like, well, if it's impossible to sell without, then this feature should be in there. Or it removes complete differentiation from the other products on the market. This feature also needs to be there. So MVP features. Here's how I kind of look at it. So how many people have heard of intelligent design? Right. So intelligent design theory is we've been designed by some creator, and not necessarily, maybe aliens, maybe God, right? And evolutionary concept is basically constant change. So I try to combine two together. So aim for adjacent possible. So if you sort of look at the adjacent possible is an interesting biology concept. So if this is a product, adjacent possible is basically where the product can move on and people can wrap their mind around it. So in here is adjacent sort of impossible. So people have to really stretch their mind, blow their mind completely in order to understand what your product does, because it's just completely evolutionary. So, I'm not saying don't design products that really blow people's mind, but really don't break at least some familiarity with what people have. Try to pick the features which are, if these are advanced features, they're really adjacent possible features. And that's how evolution moves, by the way. So, when you have an organism, it moves to adjacent possible. So all of a sudden, you don't get something from that was crawling to something that was flying, right? So you get something more grounded. Why? Because these things continuously being tested. So intelligent design concept is irreducible complexity. Basically, a complexity of something that can't be reduced any further. So if you have a bird, and the bird is a bird and it flies, and it's a simple bird as possibly. So if you take feathers away, it won't be a bird or something like that. So it's basically, if you just remove that possible complexity, it completely makes it into a different thing. So it can't take anything away and can be simpler and most efficient for what it does, right? So some of these concepts. So this is the simplest mousetrap. So if you look at it from an irreducible complexity point of view, this mousetrap is the simplest it could ever be, right? So you can come up with more complex mousetrap, but you can't come up with a simpler one. So it's like if I took away the spring, really, how would I really catch mice? I wouldn't be able to do so. So if I took away the base, I really won't be able to catch mice, right? So this is really from irreducible complexity. Think of your MVP from that perspective, right? So is this the simplest MVP that it could possibly be, or can I make it more complex? The tendency is always to make things more complex, right? Because this is going to look cool, it's going to be great, but what it does is basically, takes more time, confuses things, and does not make things better. So straightforward path to intent. So a lot of times, I think that the worst software that has been designed with straightforward path to intent is Photoshop and Facebook. I could never find how to, for instance, unfriend people on Facebook. So it's not a straightforward path to intent. So if you look at Photoshop, in order for me to do a single action, I need to do 27 clicks and things, right? So very difficult. Now, it's not a problem for an expert, right? So if I spend all of my time on Facebook and if I use Photoshop all the time, I can easily know how to do it. But the path to intent is really not straightforward. So think of it like this. How many clicks do I need to do to accomplish a particular action? So majority of your actions should be one-click actions, right? And if they're not, try to make it so. So it's, again, they're not out there, they're not hidden, right? So product don'ts. So I think from those, I think of those points from a perspective of let's not do that. Let's not complicate things. Let's not make users think, right? So if I have to really stop and think, this really messes with my usability. Don't defy users' expectations, right? So I've heard many times, well, if the users can't figure it out, that's not the users we want, right? So it's sort of the arrogance of a designer, right? So I know how to use it, that's really simple. So this is gonna be great, then users are gonna be able to figure it out. Don't confuse yourself with users. I mean, it's just one of those things. We're not designing, there's two things I've heard maybe 1,000 times. One is, it's working on my computer, I'm not sure why it's not working in production, right? So we're not shipping your computer. So it's irrelevant. And two is, you know, I can figure it out, right? So why can't the users figure it out, right? So for me, this is intuitive for me, right? So think of the users, right? Don't assume you know everything, right? So again, because the product, unless you're going to be the only consumer of your product, then don't confuse yourself. So now, so I think it's a good stopping point. Just there were overall points around, you know, do's and don'ts around the product itself. But I think the bias here is don't, you know, or main theme of the first half of the presentation is basically, you know, it's impossible to guess what the features are, right? So if I showed you the minimal viable product of the product that I build, doesn't necessarily relate to your products, right? So these are sort of the concepts. But I think one concept is universal, is you need to test, right? So the testing really what makes products perfect, right? So you need to have an MVP in order for you to start testing. Now, as a matter of fact, testing can start even in the earliest stage when you have clickable high fidelity, it just really depends what it is, right? So, you know, I've been designing a game lately that can easily be tested as just a clickable prototype where you can get early feedback. But definitely try to get into usability testing. Now, so how do you do this? Prior to that, usability testing was really, really, really difficult. So what you needed to do, in fact, there's only one type of usability test I've done in early stage of my career. It was at DirecTV, and we needed to test a particular thing. I forget what it was. I think it was TiVo or something. So we ordered a test, and it cost maybe $20,000 in order to get some people in front of the computer, and they definitely exhibited what's called a survey bias. So survey bias is basically people say one thing and do another, right? So for a number of different reasons. So people, for instance, you know, you took a survey, and you know, some people would say they vote for Barack Obama because if they said they wouldn't, people would think of them as racist, right? So this is just one of the things. But there's a number of different reasons why people do one thing or say another, right? So they don't want to look stupid or whatever it might be. So trusting those, and in case of TiVo, it was kind of interesting because some of the things that people told us, it really just didn't prove out to be true in practice, right? So survey bias was in full swing. So kind of putting people in front of the computer and asking them questions, especially in that setting, was one, super expensive. Two, it was you had a bias. Now, another thing which was very difficult is just recruiting those people. Where do you go get it? And you know, and the people who actually come in and respond to that sort of thing, it's a particular demographic. So now with the rise of crowdsourcing, you can do a lot of usability testing much quicker and cheaper, right? So you don't need $10,000, $20,000 in order to go do that. So how many people have heard of Mechanical Turk? Great, so a good half of you. So Mechanical Turk is a microtasking crowdsourcing platform by Amazon. So does anybody want to guess what is microtasking used 99% of the time? So if I wanted for people to do something, this is just an interesting nugget. Probably doesn't have anything to do with an MVP, but it's just an interesting nugget. So I'm going to spare you the suspense. 99% of the time, people want to identify what type of content this is. We have accumulated so much content that companies will pay enormous amounts of money just simply to identify what this is. So look at this video and tell me what this metadata is about, right? So I can, otherwise there's just no other way. Look at this picture and tell me what's on it, right? So it's later on discoverable. So 99% of the time, Mechanical Turk and crowdsourcing of that sort is done to identify the content. But the second thing, even though it's a small use of it, but it's becoming fairly prevalent, is basically doing crowdsourcing testing, right? So there's a number of companies that are sort of building on top of Mechanical Turk in order to do this. So now I did my own study, right? So to give you a little bit of a context, I was just testing it out and see how it would work. For a particular, this was basically a registration for, this is a marketing campaign and the registration for event software, right? So what I wanted to, I went into a particular software and basically said, let's create a campaign. What is that campaign going to look like? It's going to have 4 steps. And step number 1, go to Google. Again, I think you sort of learn how to refine these. So if one of your tasks is going to be go and write me a PhD dissertation, I think you're going to be disappointed. But so they have to be very sort of discrete and small. So you need to break it down. Now, so in here I basically said go to Google, search for event registration software, click on that particular ad, and fill out a form. So it was 4 steps, right? So I gave it to this crowdsourcing software, and I specified a particular person that I was looking for. So I didn't care about the age range, so it was fully open. And again, it gets to be pretty expensive when you do this, but it was relatively inexpensive. So a single user sourced this way, I think, was around $50, right? So in order for me to get a single user and go test it, what I wanted them to test, I just had to pay $50, right? So this is far cry from $10,000 or $20,000 that I would have to do. So again, so these are the parameters that it gave me. So if I wanted something really, really regular, irregular, 5-year-old kid with with 3 eyes, I think that would be difficult. But you could have fairly granular, targeting here. So who did I get? I get a guy named Jeff, right? So I got a guy named Jeff that basically completed 4 steps, and it gave me, this was straightforward experience and everything was great. So if this was it, this would kind of suck, right? But I got this as well. So what is this, right? So this is a video that shows Jeff doing what Jeff does, which is going into the Reg Online, register the software, and sort of looking at things. This is his voice explaining what he does. So if you could see right here, so he's puzzled. He's not sure what to do. Now, in this point in video, when he was speaking, he was saying everything is straightforward. So survey bias was right there in my face. Jeffrey was saying everything is clear, but his face was indicating confused, and puzzled really went up. Now, so I watched the entire video. Jeffrey's face is really confused all the time, but it's one of those interesting things, right? So, but it was both his voice and what he was doing. So it was sort of indicating that he was confused truly at that time, right? So each step, it tells me each step took 25 seconds, 23 seconds. So I could have just as easily said, go and register for my particular software, or do this particular path, right? Go find how to do something, right? If it was a game, go do this. If it was a particular software, go configure video, or go configure a product. If it was e-commerce or whatever it is. As long as it's straightforward, as long as Jeffrey's not going to get confused out of his mind, this is a great way for you to get actual feedback on how's your software getting used. So that's, I think that's an important step for you to be testing your MVP. So on censored feedback.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
Is the service that you use there, was that called UIs?
Correct. UI.
Oh, UI. And it, was that about $50, was that one, did you consider that a study of the 4 tasks? So would that have cost $50 roughly per person for those 4 tasks?
Yeah.
Is there,
So it would have cost,
But
and
it's
if I,
inclusive of the video and all that service was all inclusive in that $50.
it was $50 was all inclusive in all of that service. So if I wanted to target now, it would have been more expensive. It probably would have been $200 if I narrowed this category. In other words, if I said I want somebody between 18 and 20 years old, it would have been much more expensive because it's just, you know, they're harder to find, or somebody, or I don't know, maybe the other way around. You know, 60 to 65 years old to test the software, I think it would have been difficult to find. So I played around with the parameters, and it was going up to $200 and stuff like that. But still, if you're looking for that particular person to test that particular software, it's far cry from otherwise what you would have to do.
and they're testing that on their machines at home?
They're testing on their machines at home, and clearly, since I can see Jeff's face, then you know his camera has to he has to have a computer that's camera enabled and so on. So now the interesting part about this software is that they actually map Jeff's face, so you could see sort of green lines going all across, and they're monitoring his emotion, right? So if he's happy, if he's sad, if he's confused, so all of this is being measured, right? All right, so uncensored feedback is critical and very important, right? And so Jeffrey gave me a response after every step, or rather, I asked him for, this was a survey, right? So the questions was, what was the value proposition? Can you tell, right? So some of the interesting stuff, right? And again, I think this could be a cheap way for you to, prior to releasing your software to your alpha or private beta or a definitely public beta group, is for you to go and do that, right? Because the mistakes, or rather some of the assumptions or presumed knowledge that you have about your software would be all flashed out right in here, right? So if I did it 10 times and everybody was confused, then maybe I'm not ready to go into my private beta. So now these are various software packages that do stuff. Like in combination, I don't advocate any particular software, but in combination I use ClickTail. So how many people are familiar with ClickTail? ClickTail is a heat mapping software. So they tell you hot areas, cold areas, click-throughs. They tell you hover time and things like that. And some of these services are also built on top of Mechanical Turk, which is Try My UI and easy usability and so on and so forth. So, but the concept is exactly the same, right? So test your software early. All right, so this is usability. This is usability and MVP. Any questions there before we go into a dev discussion?
How often do you test the different features? Is it after every iteration?
So I would test features every time, right? So for instance, if I have a major release and I define a major release once in every 2 months, and I'm releasing some core functionality, I would test it every time.
And how many users are you typically testing?
So I think it needs to be a statistically significant sort of result for you. It just really depends how involved things are. Like I could call something a test, but actually make them do 27 steps, and that's a lot, right? So I think it just really depends. Now my recommendation is probably close to 100 if you can afford it, right? So if you can afford to do, like I think 100 is a good number from sort of good results, right? So for you to say, okay, well this is confusing now, plug. So if they all bomb after user number 10, I would stop it, right? Because you're just wasting your money. Any other questions? All right, so let's just launch into a discussion of debt. So technical debt, I think the simplest way to look at the technical debt is things slow down. So things get slow, right? So Now, how does software accumulate technical debt? So from a definition perspective, debt is basically every time you say, I want to do something later, that's debt, right? So, you know, I'm going to document later, that's debt. I'm going to test later, that's debt. I'm going to refactor later, that's debt. Later on basically means there's going to be lots of crud, and you're going to have to clean it up, right? So concept of debt is very, very similar to physical, actual money debt that you take on, right? So technical debt, you decided that you're just not going to architect your software properly, or whatever it might be. The actual physical debt, you took in money, right, and decided that you're not going to put that money into marketing. You're going to throw a party, right? So all of a sudden you just wasted all this money that you've taken in. So this is very much an equivalent concept. Some of the debt misconceptions. All debt is bad. So I'm definitely not saying that. I think debt definitely just needs to be, just make sure it's leverageable, right? So make sure that if you're taking on debt, if you're not going to test, you can at least justify in your mind that you're gonna later on come back and do it. Again, you're going to incur debt, but hopefully you have good reasoning behind it why you're doing this. And no debt is great. So no debt sometimes also means that your software never gets released, right? So for instance, I'm not gonna have a couple of developers. I'm gonna have just one. I'm gonna develop my software over 5 years, and so I'm not gonna incur any debt, and I'm gonna do everything perfectly fine and just according to, you know, whatever the most robust way I can build it, right? So this would mean that you never release the product, right? So it kind of defeats the purpose. And taking debt always gets you there faster. Sometimes, you know, again, it's like, well, let's do it fast. Let's do it really, really fast, and it's gonna be okay because we're gonna get there faster. It's basically equivalent to somebody saying, you know, I'm running a marathon. Let me run really, really fast the first 100 yards, right? So hopefully that's gonna get me there faster. So definitely pace yourself. So again, that's really the concept of debt. So again, debt needs to be leverageable, right? So if you're going to incur it, just make sure you can, you know, that mountain of debt, you can charge an admission to it. So now I'm going to tell you a debt story. So I've seen this maybe 3 or 4 times now, and you know, I don't know how many of you have seen in Men in Black, but this is where they sort of look at the alien and they can't find organs that they normally find in a human being, right? So I've seen this story a few times, and I think it's repeatable beyond just my own experiences. So this is a CEO Tales that repeated itself exactly to a T. So we were very productive. So the CEO is telling me, I came to sort of be an advisor for the company, and that here's what the CEO is telling me. So we were very productive, we kicked ass, and then we became complacent. So that's so we kicked ass basically meant that we, you know, I sat down with the engineers and we were just humming, and the software got produced and everything was really great. So we became complacent, so I just fired them, right? So I hired a new team, and they're not productive either. So I must have chosen the wrong team. So I fired them as well, right? So save me, right? So this is the CEO's tale. This is the previous CTO's tale, right? So we were very productive through debt accumulation, right? CTO has a concept of debt. We kicked ass but burned out, right? We slowed down due to debt, right? We got fired. So new team got hired. It doesn't know where skeletons are buried. So they just simply don't know anything, right? So they got fired as well. So then it brings me to I haven't seen organs like this. So basically, I feel like a surgeon in front of the body. I open it up. I'm like, oh, I haven't seen organs like this, right? So this is not fixable. This is now to a point where the debt killed the software. So now the only thing for us to do is to go rewrite it, right? So this repeated itself several times. So I think it's very repeatable. So I don't have any particular study to substantiate these numbers, but this is what's been in my experience. Year number 1, support. So you are really, if you're writing software, you're in support business. So first year, and this really correlates, the first year you have 15%, that's devoted to support and 85% to innovation. So what that really means, 85% you're writing code and 15% supporting. Year 2, it's 50-50. And year 3, if you're lucky, your innovation is 15%. So 85%, so whatever this CEO was interpreting as we're slowing down, we became complacent, is really the mountain of debt that they're just carrying around, which is not, you know, we don't test, now we change something, as something else breaks, and so on. So just basically a wrong interpretation of the picture, right? So I've seen this as bad as 95% to 5, right? So which is basically 95% of the time. So you're working really on a dead buddy. It's a dead software. So you're just basically, you're just polishing it up and just removing, you know, putting few features in, and it really doesn't, you know, it's really not going to go anywhere. So how many people have heard of a broken window theory, right? So it's the theory of crime, right, in New York City, where, so there's 2 corollaries to this. So typically it goes like this. If you have a house with a little bit of graffiti and a broken window, what's going to happen is, if you don't take care of it, within the months you're going to have a house with all broken windows and full of graffiti, right? So it's just a social thing that kind of repeats itself. Now, what that really translates to is the following in the technical terms. So when you have a team that doesn't, or you have one developer that does a certain thing, and then team gets hired. Now they sort of see how things are done, and they kind of keep doing it this way, right? So even though they feel that's not necessarily right, but they sort of keep falling into this pattern, right? And so another corollary of this is basically small vandalism leads to crime, right? Urban decay leads to crime. So do sweat the small stuff. It might seem like, okay, well, these tests are not going to kill the company. Oh, yes, they will eventually, because that's a mindset, right? So unless you really set that mindset correctly, you will kill the company, because new people will come in, and you will tell them what the good process is about here, and everybody's kick-ass here, and everybody's great, and you know, you should do things in the right way, but they will notice what the actual process is, and they're going to keep following this process. So keep that in mind. So now, debt has a tipping point, and this sort of, the graph represents what that picture represented. So year 1, you have your product grows, and the debt doesn't grow as much, and then you have about 50-50, and then you have a tipping point. Within the 3 years, you could have a tipping point where really nothing, you have, you know, year 4 death of the product. How many people have been in the companies where by year 4 product has to be rewritten? Not many. Okay, so this is almost every company where I've been. Year 4, it's a dead product, right? So you have to go and just redo it again. I think it's basically a product death. Technical data elements, right? So lack of architectural blueprint. So some of the things you need to be looking at. We don't have an architectural blueprint, that's dead. No unit testing, that's dead. Integration, no integration testing, that's dead. No code reviews, that's dead. No starting platform, and so on. So all of these things contribute to debt, right? So keep that in mind. So if you don't have that, you know, you're incurring some of the technical debt. So decision stack. So quite often I get asked, the new CEO comes to me and says, what is the best programming language should we choose? So I think that's really a wrong question. It's actually a funnel. Shouldn't be looking, programming language, it's basically a decision that's at the very, very bottom of the funnel. Very top of the funnel, it's, you know, is there a starting product on the market that I can pick up, right? So even though the argument could be made, you know, you're sort of exchanging your debt for somebody else's debt, but at least it's in the public domain, then people just use open source software all the time now. Right, so that's the first question you should be asking about, what is the starter product we're building on? So if there's no starter product that we can morph, and it's hard for me to believe that, because usually everything out there now has an open source product that you can kind of build on top. So it's very difficult to believe that you don't. Now, so at least you will have some sort of platforms, and if not platforms, you will use some sort of frameworks. And if not frameworks, then you get to programming languages. So again, it's at the bottom of the funnel. So some of the frameworks, right? So whatever tickles your fancy, right? So Node.js for server-side JavaScript, or .NET, or Ruby on Rails, or Django, or Spring for Java, or Laravel for PHP. So all of these things are really, really frameworks. So it's just sort of, you know, don't think in languages. Think in frameworks, and think in products. Now, again, programming language. So programming language is really, really irrelevant. It only matters in terms of resources and starter product availability. Yes?
I wanted to add another that is sort of an operating system for a website that we're absolutely like really benefiting from is Drupal. It's you don't need to know you don't need to know like you in front of a text editor and write everything. It's like I want X type of thing that has voting and a social thing. Well, there's already software and you just kind of piece it together.
Sure.
It's super.
So
As long as you don't have to customize.
So how many people are familiar with Drupal? So yeah, basically Drupal is very common CMS. It's pretty complicated CMS with lots of depth, but as you said, there are just so many plugins that can kind of allow for you to. I've seen quite a few products being sort of built on top of Drupal and many other CMSs. Just really depends if it works for you. But again, think of it as think of it in terms of products, and don't think of it in terms of programming languages. Programming languages is kind of the lost consideration. So people get sort of hung up on it. And also remember this: there's no good Ruby developers, but at the same time sort of bad C developers. So developers are either good or bad irrespective of the language, right? Developer is a mindset, not a you might lack Ruby Ruby experience, but you learn it, right? So you're either a good engineer, good software developer, or you're not. So that's as far as the hiring is concerned. So organizational debt. So one of the things that's important is you cannot outsource what you don't understand. If you don't understand development, you need to get a co-founder that understands development, right? You can't outsource what you don't understand. You're gonna end up in the situation that I'm gonna describe a little later, 90% problem. So in my mind, here's what the MVT looks like. So this day and age, you need a designer, UX, UI, part-time person, right? So you also need mobile HTML5 JavaScript. So the modern architectures almost demand that you have a responsive design, and you start with the mobile with mobile in mind, right? That's a recommendation. No matter what you're designing, start with mobile in mind. And so from a decoupled nature of how the architectures are put in place, front end Java-centric front end will help you do quick prototyping and quick testing. So person number 3, sysadmin DBA DevOps, right? Don't assume your developers will know or do this, right? So you need to have a separate person that does this. You're lucky if you can find one person that does all of this. Usually it's several, but if you can, you can. So you're lucky. Lead developer, right? So you should have a lead developer, and you should have 2 engineers. Why 2, not 3, and so on. So we're going to look at that. So from MVT perspective, I sort of see it as 5.5 people team. Again, not for the prototype, really for the MVP and the product going forward, right? So it's just one of a kind, right? So can we afford? You obviously need to answer a question. Can we afford it? So now, one person is conspicuously missing here. So who's a product guy? So who's typically a product guy? If you're lucky, the product guy here is a CTO, right? So the importance of the CTO, I've seen a lot of times where the CTO plays a role of lead developer, and you really get shortchanged on the product. So you basically fall into the categories of the products that I'm describing, which is the products with the very good technical backbone, but really from a front end and the product perspective, they're poorly designed and poorly done. So your CTO should definitely, half of your CTO should be a product guy. So if your CTO doesn't understand from a customer perspective what you're building, you're not going to get what you want. And that's why full outsourcing doesn't work, because on that side, they don't understand what product you're building, right? So even technically they can do it, really they don't understand your product. So there's lots of arguments there. Some people say it's not like that, right? So if you're going to do offshore development, kind of do it for the right reason. Don't be hung up on the price, right? So I sort of found in my career that good developers are 10 times more productive than bad developers. So sort of by that corollary out of that, you should pay as much as you can for good developers, right? Because they're 10 times more productive.
Sorry, question.
Yes.
So which ones do you actually get into the company and give equity if you actually find those people? And which ones do you outsource or not?
So we're gonna cover this, some of this. So now, if you can get a lead developer, get that lead developer for equity, get your CTO for equity. So you should sort of think of it, of this, the brain of the operation on this side of the Atlantic, right? So you can more easily source, other talent, and sort of you can get them. Now, the others, like it's by very nature, it's very difficult to get designer, UX, UI person, good people offshore. Like again, it's a generalization, but it hasn't been my experience. So you normally get them here. Make sense? All right, so all the wrong reasons, right? Solution to ignorance, that does not work, right? So can't outsource what you don't understand. It will be cheaper. So overhead is at least 30%. Communication overhead, most of the time it's actually 50%. So at the very minimum, it's 50% on communication overhead. It can achieve instant scalability. It does take time to hire. Good developers, they are just as in demand as they're here. So poaching is not a problem. That's not true. Poaching is definitely a problem, maybe not as much. And you can minimize office distraction. That's actually the office hallway magic, right? How many people heard that? So magic really happens in hallways, right? So these discussions in the offices and things like that, it's important, right? So so what you consider an office distraction, it really could be just, it really is hallway magic, right? So right reasons. Somewhat easier to find talent, 24-hour dev development cycle, improved ramp up, ramp down cycle. So they're consultants, right? So if the company is not doing well, they're expected that they can be reduced down, right? And specific expertise. So there's, I was working with this company in Israel because it was charting the software in 24 different dimensions, right? I couldn't find a company in the United States that did that, right? So I had to go offshore because this was some hardcore development stuff that needed to be done, and I couldn't find people with expertise. So those are the reasons. Question? No?
I have a question. What do you mean by somewhat easier to find talent?
Well, it's easier than to find. So try finding talent in in Venice Beach, right? So it's almost impossible, right? Because there's so many startups, talent gets slurped up, right? So the talent that you could find here is basically developers, right? So the developers are more easier to find in other places than they would be in LA or San Francisco, for instance, where you have to overpay for talent.
Okay, the right reasons to outsource.
That's the right reasons to outsource. So 90% problem. So what do they mean by that, right? So many times I have a CEO coming to me and saying, we're almost done, right? So we're like 90% there. We just need a little bit of polish. And so what do they actually mean by that? So 90% means 90% of the money has been spent. That's what they mean by that. And how do I know that this is going to be a problem? Because offshore team did all the work, and there's no business documentation, no technical documentation, no repeatable process, a lead developer instead of a CTO, so I know this is going to be a 90% problem. So I think that's an important thing to watch out for. So performance problems right out of the gate. So now, outsourcing done right. So I'm a firm believer in what I call a sort of buddy program. So what that means is keeping at least 50% of the staff onshore and 50% of the staff offshore. And every developer works with a developer onshore, so you have a pair, right? And so the work is assigned to a pair. They're not assigned to a single developer or a team. Because what occurs there is what's called information attenuation. So what that means is, here's the typical scenario. Two project managers talk to each other, and then they talk to developers, and then those developers talk to other developers because those others don't speak English. So I think that's an issue that quite often occurs. And so the information of what you meant for the product to be really attenuates, and you have a problem. So you should couple developers together. What you get there is almost instant scalability. That's one. And if you need to cut the team, you can cut the team and not lose any of the information lost in translation between two different teams, right? So you're going to have at least knowledge sharing that's built into it. So body pairing, so not your grandfather's pair programming. So get paired, your counterpart, Truman Show your life on TV. So what that basically means, you need to have at least 4 hours of overlap, so you could both be on the camera on Skype or whatever it might be. So joint work assignment, right? So you work as a unit. And circle of influence, so you sort of have product manager, project manager, QA development buddy. So that's in my mind an effective way. Doesn't always work out that way. You don't always have money for half of your staff to be, to be onshore. Okay. Any questions there? All right. So you need to pick congruent culture. So how many people? Malcolm Gladwell, Korean Airlines been crashing. So how many people know that story? So I'm just gonna quickly recap that story. So they had Korean Airlines that was crashing much more frequently than others. And so they determined the reason for that was culture. So basically a co-pilot would not contradict a pilot even to save his own life. Think about this. They would not contradict a pilot to save their own life. So actually what they changed is basically the first time co-pilot says something and the pilot doesn't do it, co-pilot is obligated to take reins into their own hands, right? So it's really a cultural problem. Think about 99% of the problems where I've seen offshore not working, it's a cultural incongruence, right? So it's one team on the US side is expecting one thing and the team elsewhere is expecting something else, right? So just keep that in mind. So it needs to be a congruent culture. And so if you go to cultures which are not necessarily of the same mindset, just set the rules of the game, which is, so I can tell you what one of the most critical things in the culture of offshoring that has to be there, ability to challenge authority, right? So you should have an offshore team that can challenge authority. If you can't, it's a wrong culture, right? So people need to be trained, right? So it might not be okay to say that the boss is wrong, but in software development and in product development, it doesn't work like that, right? So the authority needs to be challenged. Yes?
Can you give examples of cultures that you think fit well with us versus cultures that you think don't?
It's a dangerous territory, right? So it's hard for me to sort of pinpoint particular cultures, but I've seen, so I'm gonna say which cultures are congruent. Like for instance, Eastern Europe, Israel, cultures seem to be education, so let me strike that. It's not only culture, it's also education. How the education is really done. Like for instance, if you look at the education, Eastern Europe, you're required to actually do verbal examination, right? So the people don't take multiple tests, and so they actually challenge authority, they challenge their teachers, right? So the educational program needs to be such a way, right? So I think those places are great. I also think that, for instance, Latin America is great. So I've been having lots of success with Argentina, for instance, or Brazil, right? And also not the culture, educational system is such that it allows for that sort of thing, where they would easily challenge authority, say that you're wrong, so this is not the best way to do it. So they'd be just fine with it. And if you tell them again, I mean, they will keep insisting and keep insisting. I think that's important. I mean, it's not a culture of fighting, right? It's a culture of coming up with the best solution. So from a team structure perspective, so sort of think about it. I typically divide. So if you look at that glass, so typically what I've seen in the organizations where the product is being built, a lot of things get thrown into that glass which are small and sort of big rocks don't fit, right? So from a team structure perspective, I try to separate a team that does core development, which is big rocks, and teams that do bug fixing and small features, right? So that's why I kind of had two developers. At the very, very least, you should have one guy who's devoted to bugs and who's devoted to small features, who really, really listens to the feedback from the customers. So sort of core development and rapid development, right? So try to think of it in those terms, right? Because I've seen it time and time again. You know, we've done a lot of stuff, but really never done. You know, this release was 57 things was released, but nothing truly, truly important because we were taking care of the small stuff. So, so that was technical debt. Any questions about technical debt? Yes.
How do you go about balancing that sort of, between testing and moving rapidly, for example? At an early stage when you're building an MVP and you want to get your product in the hands of the customers as quickly as possible, you don't really have always the time to be careful about writing quality code or having the right architecture. So obviously, like you said, over a long period of time, that's probably going to kill the company, but at what point do you start?
So here's what I recommend. I recommend scheduling sprints that nothing but taking care of technical debt. So do core release, and then take care of some of the technical debt. I think not testing or not putting unit tests in place, it's really, I think now it's just absolute requirement. Just think about the following, and people sort of don't think of it this way, but I'm not going to clean my teeth every day. I'm just going to wait a month and just clean really, really hard, right? So does that really work? So no, it doesn't. But sort of keep that in mind. You shouldn't really be sacrificing speed. But again, you might end up with a house of broken windows where you can't really go fast anymore, right? So at the point where you start noticing this, I think that's the issue.
I was going to piggyback off the same question, basically. Because doesn't it change as the company goes through the stages? Because at the beginning you might scrap the MVP if it doesn't do well, so you don't want to over-invest in it.
So again, MVPs are not designed to be scrapped, right? So hopefully they're not. So MVPs, they're iterative in nature, unless you really, so intent matters, right? So if you're planning to scrap it, then you can go
isn't
there.
it kind of based on the results, or you?
It could be. It could be very, so by the time of the MVP, and it just really depends at what stage of the company have you gotten funded and so on. So some of the goals could really, really change, right? But keep that in mind that when you're saying, I want to move really, really fast, not having those things stops you from moving fast, right? So it's like, we don't have unit tests all of a sudden, so Alex went and sort of did some code and all of a sudden it's all broken, right? So, well, that stopped me from, that's not an actual example. So, but yeah, so that could be that, right? So you're basically stumbling and sort of getting in your own way. Am I running?
Yeah, usually it's about an hour or so, but can we finish up? Most people have to go.
Okay, so let's cover some of the process debt, and you know, we can stop right there, and I can take questions. So from a process debt perspective, so how many people have been to Japan? Now the interesting thing, so this is a plot of sort of the several houses, and they're sort of all marked this way, and you know, it's in Okinawa, and it's really not clear, like, how do they know which house, like, how do they differentiate between one house to the other? So, you know what the answer is? Mailman knows, right? So mailman knows which house is which. Now that's process debt, right? So you have a single guy in the neighborhood that, you know, people who live there clearly know, but the new people, you know, if I came into that neighborhood, I wouldn't know, right? So that's process debt, and so the mailman is the one that's carrying all this process debt. So whatever you do on the process, don't make it complicated, right? So God forbid if it looks like that. So, you know, complicated is bad, it's unsustainable, it's not going to be followed. So just try as much as possible to make a simple process that people can follow. And again, it doesn't really matter if your process is published. New people will come in and they kind of, okay, I get it. So this is what you want me to do, but what do I actually need to do in order to get some work done, right? So, and people will tell them actual process. So planned versus agile. So how many people know what agile is and what planned process is? Okay, so, you know, planned process is basically a waterfall process, and it's always the same. You know, it's sort of very, very iterative in nature. And agile process is a high-level process. The majority of the companies now, it's an accepted practice to run agile. So planned versus agile, prescriptive, document-centric. Agile is iterative. You wanted to make it your own. You definitely, you know, it's not very. Every company where I've been, even if the process by the same name, it's called different because it's basically implemented differently because it's a high-level set of practices that you should do. So now this is an agile umbrella, right? So you have, you know, feature-driven development, you have lean, you have Kanban, you have Scrum, extreme programming. So all of these are variations of agile process, right? So this is agile unified process, not meant to be. This is carry away deck, by the way. All of these slides are going to be available online. So process data elements. So like I've articulated process, if you don't tell people how things are going to be done, so that's in of an ad hoc process. And lack of process documentation, lack of repeatability, clear process identification, so all results in that process busters, which is basically upper management of the company. I don't care how this gets done here. I'm gonna tell, you know, we're gonna release this, but today is not the release date. It's gonna be Thursday. No, we're gonna go and release it. So make sure that everybody's held to the same standard. Right, so that's very important. False agile. I've seen so many people calling things agile, but it's really not. It's just something. It's just clearly something that doesn't have a name, right? So people just use all kinds of words in order to define agile. And you're not agile if your requirements are front-loaded. If all of the requirements are generated up front, you're not agile. So if you're doing QA backloading, QA is done only when the product is produced instead of in between stages. You move dates instead of negotiating features. You extend sprints or iterations. Those need to be fixed. There's no business representation. Only technical people are there. You're not tracking requirements, and you don't keep track of how quickly you're going, so you can get some repeatability. So I'm just not going to cover infrastructure debt. I'm going to take questions overall on the presentation and the rest of it, and just hopefully, and kind of going through, maybe come back to some of the questions, but I think we answered the majority of them. So open for questions. Don't be afraid. I don't buy. Yes.
Have you had any particular success with different outsourcing platforms or sites?
Outsourcing. So every company where I've been, we outsourced.
Okay.
Right? We outsourced kind of the right way, the buddy way, right? So
Okay.
Divided the team and outsourced it that way.
You know, let me ask you in terms of finding outsourced talent. You know, are there any particular channels that you found have worked out better than others?
Channels, as in what do you mean?
Freelance or
So no. The answer is no. And as a matter of fact, in my last company, I went through 6 outsourced shops, and as a matter of fact, we ended up with 3 with different specialties, and that's the way I like it. And I went into the country to select them. So I actually wanted to see what their environment looked like. So I went there, and this was, we had it sort of dispersed because we wanted to keep 24-hour development cycle. So we had people in Belarus, we've had people in Ukraine, and we had people in Argentina. Yes.
So what if you have a couple of guys who are marketing guys who have an idea?
Yes.
But they don't have money, and they need to outsource their development work.
So try to find technical co-founder, right? So technical co-founder is important in order to make that thing hold. Like, it doesn't mean it can't work, right? It's just the chances of success are much lower, right? So you need to find a technical. So if you can't find a technical co-founder, find an interim CTO or some technical person that you could trust. So there's quite a, you know, I mean, especially around here, there's a whole array of sort of people who don't want to do full-time in one particular company, but they do that sort of advising and mentoring and so on. Yes. Yes, yes.
Is there any software for technical teams keeping track of notes?
So you mean like
It's not like typical project management, but you know.
So I specifically don't have it here. I had another section of it which was called organizational tool belt. What that means, the suite of tools I like to. So I wish I bought stock in Atlassian because I really like the company. Everywhere I've been, I implemented Atlassian. Atlassian is a suite of products that gets used. It's basically Confluence, Jira. So you know, Confluence is enterprise wiki. Jira is a process management software. So I really like Atlassian. So I can't recommend them highly enough. Now, typically there's what I've seen done, the people do it sort of one of 2 ways: best of breed, or one ring rules them all. So in case of Atlassian, it's one ring rules them all because they have an entire suite that you would ever need. And typically those never work, but Atlassian that's one of the interesting companies where they bought several pieces and they kind of made a suite. And best of breed is basically best of breed. You find software out there. So Podio is one of the latest ones. Sprintly is for documents. It's for project management. Yes, sir.
When you're gathering information from the users to feedback into the decisions around the product, do you find that you're better off observing and trying to discern what they do into what should be built, or do you try and actually have a discussion with them and have them tell you what it is? Like, do you know what I mean? What does work better in your experience?
What worked better for me is to avoid software bias. Surveyor bias is not to ask them, but really have them verbalize it. They give you clues, right? Like Jeffrey gave a lot of clues, right, because I had them verbalize what he was doing, right? So every step that he was doing, he had to say it, right? I am going to Google, typing google.com. I am going to go to software and fill out first name, last name, and so on. So he verbalized every step of it.
Right, and you found that you have to internalize that
information
to actually come up with a decision about this feature or removing that feature.
Exactly.
Typically, when you go ask them, like, do you think we should keep this feature or remove this feature?
Right. So in practical world, it's one of two ways, right? So it's HIPAA principle, high place per person opinion, which is your boss tells you, I want this feature in, right? And you're like, okay, well, that's not going to quite work. So it's one way, or the other way is basically listen to the customers. Now with some of your own sort of thoughts brought into it, right? But I try sort of check my bias at the door as well, right? Because I know how to use it, but somebody else might not. So, but I try to internalize and not ask straight up questions where do you want this feature or not? I asked whether this was straightforward and so on. So typical surveyor type qualitative analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I'm curious, when do you think prototypes are the most useful to do? Like what, do you always do them, or do you think that they're more useful in certain cases than others?
I think prototypes should probably be done in 100% of the time. One is they inform your own thinking, that's one. Number two, like I said, they indicate to others that you're serious. Unless you're actually bootstrapping all the way, you're not going to get funded unless you have a prototype with few exceptions. You're not going to get accepted to this wonderful incubator if you don't have a prototype or some form of product built, right?
Yeah.
So
Do
it's
you
just
think it matters if it's a paper or if it's digital or any?
it matters. So it matters. It's closer to what the users are going to be using, right? So if it's if it's crayon drawings, it's not quite that, right? So it has to be something closer to. But prototype, really a prototype, right?
It depends on your goal too, right? If
Yeah.
you're trying to get money and you brought a piece of paper, unless you've previously proven that you can go from paper to product, like very effectively, I have no way of knowing that you're going to be able to accomplish that.
Yeah. So thank you, Jeff. That's precisely right, which is, like, unless you bring a track record of ability to build something, they're going to start asking you different questions. Not can you build it, but can you sell it? But from a product perspective, are you going to be able to build it, right? Because building, you can see that building is pretty perilous road, right? So it's just tough to do.
And you definitely can't sell it if you can't build it. So a lot of people do jump to that, like, oh, the market's huge. Like,
Yeah,
I can
exactly.
sell this. Like, okay, but can you actually
build
get
it?
something in the first place?
Yes.
What do you think of a company like SourceBits that actually offers, to help you build that design, your idea, help you build that idea? You have to put in
I like
minimum amount of money, and I mean they're one of the biggest designers.
I like.
You know that program?
Yes. So I really like companies like product companies that take equity and in your product, and also you pay them, right? So it's a combination of equity, and so they're sort of become your partner. There's quite a few companies like this, and so I think that.
Do you think that it's helpful? That it could be successful?
Oh, it's super. It's helpful, and now it's especially became it was helpful for companies that were building sort of like mobile apps, right? So small mobile apps.
And how far are they going to go with interacting, or are they really going to be partner with you? Like,
so you're gonna get out of them what you put into it, right?
They're like an accelerator, but
Yeah,
have to
so
pay
they're
money
they're
instead
sort of like that, exactly. So that you don't pay them, they pay you. But,
Yeah, you
rather
have
the
to
other
pay
way
them
around.
instead of-
Yeah, you pay them, and they take a little bit of equity, but they take equity not because, I mean, one, it's good business, but if you succeed, right? And they're also take less for the development that they otherwise would, so
Yes.
which basically means they believe in your idea, right? So you can get any developer to start developing for you if you just pay them a ton of money, right? They don't necessarily need to believe in the product. So, but at least you get some sort of interest in the product itself. Yes.
What are examples of those type of ones?
So there's a company I know called Giraffe. So it's I think they're out of New York. So
Sorry, what was the question?
what are the examples of these companies that do this for you? So one of them that it's not a recommendation. I'm just saying it's they do that sort of stuff. Yes.
When can you tell it's the right time to move from MVP to an actual product?
So when you breach that chasm, right? So when you get a lot less. So when the usability study is such that people understand what your product is about, what it's doing, and you're going to start adding features, right? So when you can breach that chasm, that's the time. Any other questions? Yes.
Is it weird to hit that chasm and have to rewrite all the code?
No, it's very common. It's very, very common because people incur by that time so much debt that that you have to rewrite it. In other words, the MVPs that are truly that could be evolutionary are very, very few. I've seen a lot more, but typically, hopefully you already did a prototype and you threw it away, right? So it's like, okay, now we can do it for real. Any others? All right.
Thank you
Well,
very much.